Another example. How about within an H1, ah. And then I'm going to force the font size to be something insane, like, I don't know, 100 pixels. And then we're not done. I will open up a script tag and say, hi from JavaScript. All right. Yeah. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's keep going right where we left off at the conclusion of the last video. So we now know how to respond to when the user submits a form. So next up, let's die and dump the post superglobal and have a look. So back to Firefox, right here, and you'll notice behind the scenes, I've cleared out all of the notes so that we can start from scratch. Okay, so we will add some gibberish here, submit the form, and sure enough, we get an array of all of the inputs or the values from the form. Okay, so now the next step would be to take those values and insert them into the database, right? Into the notes table. All right, well, let's see how we might do that. All right, so let's do this. Let's go into notes.php, and maybe one more time, I'm going to copy and paste this, and then I'll show you a cleaner way that we can allow for things like this. Okay, so now I can say db query, and you know what? We haven't yet reviewed the syntax for an insert query, but I'll show you a little trick. Let's go to table plus and manually add a note, something. User ID is 1, and I'll hit save. And you'll notice if I go to the history tab, here I can see a list of all of the actual SQL queries that are being executed within Table Plus. So yeah, in this case, it looks like we say insert into the name of the table, and then the columns, and then values, and then the corresponding values. Great, so this is especially useful during the learning phase. So let's go back to PHP Storm, and I'll use that. Insert into notes, the body and the user ID. And yeah, for the values, exact same thing. We're going to leverage prepared statements so that we avoid any risk of funny business or SQL injection. So yeah, the values will be wildcards or parameters here, body and user ID. And I will pass those through as the second argument. All right, so body will be post body. So grab the body value or attribute from the form. And then we will do user ID. And yeah, we haven't yet reviewed session handling or authentication. So I'm going to hard code this, but I promise we're going to get to it. All right, let's just see what happens now. So back to Firefox, give it a refresh. Keep learning PHP. We save it. And we're not really providing feedback, which we probably should. PHP. We save it. And we're not really providing feedback, which we probably should. But if I go to Table Plus and give this a refresh, and there we go. It works. We're in business. So, very cool, but also very risky. And here's what I mean. Yes, you wrote prepared statements, which is great. You've avoided that potential pitfall. But that doesn't mean all of your security concerns are solved. So have a look here. Let's create a new note. And I'm just going to say work on, and then I'll say within strong tags something. And then why don't we add some classes here? So I know this website uses Tailwind, right? So why don't we say text red 500 and font bold? All right, interesting, right? What do you think is going to happen here? We save it. We go back to our list of notes. We save it. We go back to our list of notes. And it's red and bold. And maybe you're thinking, well, of course, what did you expect to happen? But this could be a really big problem. And here's why. I'll show you another example. How about within an H1, and then I'm going to force the font size to be something insane, like, I don't know, 100 pixels. And then we're not done. I will open up a script tag and say, hi from JavaScript. All right. Yeah, let's see what happens here. Save it. We go to all of our notes. Now, every single person who visits this page is going to see an alert. Yeah, so now imagine you're building like a Stack Overflow site or something like that. If you didn't add the necessary sanitizing and precautions, well, now thousands and thousands of people are going to see an alert or something way worse when they visit the page. And even beyond that, notice how because we gave the user full control, they've completely borked the presentation of our notes list. So yeah, clearly none of this is desirable. All right, how can we fix it? And let's see, yeah, we have a couple options here. One method would be to sanitize the body of the note before it enters the database. And yeah, that would work. Another option that's very common is to simply allow it to enter the database, but then always escape it when you display it on the page. And I'll show you what that looks like. Let's go into our list of notes. And yeah, right up here, here's where we display the note. And yeah, right here, instead of blindly echoing whatever the user has typed into that form, why don't we first pass it to a built-in PHP function called HTML special chars or cars. All right, so first, let's see what happens, and then we'll talk a little more. Back to Firefox, I give it a refresh. All right, good deal. It seems like we've solved the problem. We're no longer displaying an alert for every single person who loads this web page. And further, we've restricted the author's ability to control the presentation of this notes list, which is good. But yeah, just keep in mind, if I click on the note, right back in that same boat. So this is where we come back to that idea of the user is guilty until proven innocent. Or really, you don't even need to say until proven innocent. Just assume that they're trying to do something bad. Even if 99% of people are good, you have to assume that they're going to try something malicious. So that's why we run any user-provided input or values through functions like this, HTML special chars. And you can see here, it's going to convert all applicable characters to HTML entities. Yeah, so if I close this out, back to Firefox, view the source, let's go back to our list here and view the source. You can see, where are we? So yeah, right down here. So notice how that HTML special chars function converted the angled brackets here and the quotes to their HTML entity equivalents. And when you do that, this thing here is no longer treated as an HTML tag. It's treated as just a long string. And that's exactly what we want. Again, just to make it crystal clear, if I brought this back to what we started with and we give it a refresh, scroll to the bottom, now it is treated as HTML, which is why we see that alert. All right, good to know. So let's update this, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing anywhere else we display the note. So how about one right here? And I will paste that. All right, but as always, and I'm going to tell you this a million times, we're not done yet. There's still more things to consider. For example, what if I try to create a note and I don't provide anything? Does that work? Seems like it does. All right. What if I just keep clicking this? 3, 4, 5? Yeah, what is that? 5 or 6 notes that are empty? And if I come back to the list here, well, it's collapsed. But if I hit Shift Command C, yeah, here's all of the list items that are being rendered to display what is empty notes. And again, we don't want to allow that. We don't want to allow that. So yeah, it can be a little overwhelming at times. I get it. There's so many things you have to think about. In this video alone, we leveraged prepared statements to avoid the risk of SQL injection. And then we used the HTML special chars function to convert any potential HTML into their HTML entity equivalents. And now it seems like we also need a layer of validation to ensure that the user, when they submit the form, is providing to us the values and the data and the types that we expect. So we'll take a look at that last element, validation, in the next video. I'll see you then. All right, welcome back, everybody. In the last episode, we left off with a cliffhanger, didn't we? We currently have the situation where a user can insert empty data into our database table, which of course we don't want to allow. Okay, so the solution is to apply a layer of validation, and I'll show you how to do that in this episode. All right, so yeah, just to restate the problem, notice right now, if I leave the body text area blank, I can still submit the form. And if I now switch to Table Plus and give it a refresh, we have an empty row that has just been persisted. Okay, so I know what you might be thinking. Your first thought might be, well, let's go to our form, and here here's our text area right here. Let's give it a reformat. And let's add the required attributes. So if If you're not familiar with this, this states that, well, I can't make it any simpler, actually. It states that the text area is required. You have to give us something in order to submit the form. So if I come back and give this a refresh, like that, notice now if I try to submit the form, it will prevent me from doing so. All right, so yeah, you might think, problem solved. And even better, you didn't even need to write a line of code. Simply append the required attribute to any form inputs that are required. But it's useful, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. So you can think of this as a layer of browser validation or client-side validation. And it is useful. It provides immediate feedback to the user to help them. But there's nothing preventing the user from simply bypassing this layer of validation. And I'll show you what I mean. If I go to my terminal, yeah, there's nothing preventing me from manually submitting this post request. And I can use curl for that. So I can say curl-x, and that declares the request type. In our case, we want a post request. The URL, let's switch back, see if we can find it. Yeah, it's going to be localhost port 8888. And then the URI is notes/create. Next, I will pass -d to provide the data to go along with this post request. So I can say, all right, well, the body should be nothing. We submit it. And yeah, if I now go back to Table Plus and give it a refresh, yeah, there we go. So you see what I mean? We've now bypassed that client-side or browser layer of validation. Okay, and in fact, if I just do it over and over, yeah, we're right back in that same boat. Okay, so don't get me wrong, it is useful to add that required attribute because it provides instant feedback, validation feedback to the user, but we can never exclusively depend on it. Okay, so the next step is to add some server-side validation. All right, let's go back to our controller. And yeah, right here, let's see. It sounds like before we run our query, we should first confirm that the body meets our criteria. And we'll do it inline to start. All right, so let's see. I'm going to use the strlen function that PHP provides. Of course, that stands for string length. And we're going to look at the post body attribute. And if its length is 0, well, then it's blank. And that means our validation should fail, right? All right, so how do we represent this? Why don't we start by saying create a variable called errors, and that'll be an empty array. And then we'll do our validation checks. And if this one fails, we will append to that array like this. Errors body equals a body is required. Okay, so now Now think about it. If our validation fails, or in other words, if the errors array is not empty, should we still run this query to update the database? And of course, the answer is no. We should effectively abort and return to the form and then notify the user about what they did wrong or what validation error occurred. Okay, so let's see. If that's the case, all right, so we can check if an array is empty or has no members or items by using the empty function. So yeah, if I did something like this, we're saying, all right, if there are no validation errors, then it's safe to proceed. So I could nest that here. Otherwise, we don't run that query and we require the view. But now when we require the view, there is an errors variable. Okay, so let's see what happens now. Let's do this. Right now, I can't submit the form because we added that required attribute, which is helpful, but it's not helpful when I'm testing this out. So just temporarily, I'm going to disable that. But yeah, in real life and at the end of the video, I will return it. Okay, so one more time, I try to submit the form and notice if we did everything correctly, well, actually, let's clear that out and then we'll try it again. So yeah, I will submit this form a bunch of times. And if we did everything correctly, when I give this a refresh, we no longer have those empty records. Okay, so I'm going to disable that. But yeah, in real life, it's not helpful when I'm testing this out. So just temporarily, submit the form. Okay, so let's see. Then it's safe to proceed. So I could nest that here. Otherwise, we don't run that query and we require the view. But now when we require the view, there is an errors variable. Okay, so let's see what happens now. Let's do this. Right now, I can't submit the form because we added that required attribute, which is helpful, but it's not helpful when I'm testing this out. So just temporarily, I'm going to disable that. But yeah, in real life and at the end of the video, I will return it. Okay, so one more time, I try to submit the form and notice if we did everything, check if an array is empty or has no members or items by using the empty function. So yeah, if I did something like this, we're saying, all right, if there are no validation errors, then it's safe to proceed. So I can nest that here. Otherwise, we don't run that query and we require the view. But now when we require the view, there is an errors variable. Okay, so let's see what happens now. Okay, so let's see what happens now. Actually, let's do this. Right now, I can't submit the form because we added that required attribute, which is helpful, but it's not helpful when I'm testing this out. So just temporarily, I'm going to disable that. But yeah, in real life and at the end of the video, I will return it. Okay, so one more time, I try to submit the form and notice if we did everything correctly, well, actually, let's clear that out and then we'll try it again. So yeah, I will submit this form a bunch of times. And if we did everything correctly, when I give this a refresh, we no longer have those empty records. Okay, so our validation is in fact working. But now the next issue, as we discussed, is that we're not providing any feedback to the user. So they have no clue what the problem is. Okay, let's do this. Let's go into our view. And yeah, right below the text area. So let's do this. Let's say, look at the errors array and see if we have anything for body. And if we do, then we should display that validation message for the user, like this, errors body. And then we can close this out. Yeah, and I think that would do the trick. So now if we come back and I submit the form, yeah, it doesn't look too pretty right now, but at least we're providing some level of feedback to the user, which is great. Okay, so now let's make it look a little more attractive by saying, how about make it red, and then extra small, and then a little margin on the top. Okay, one more time. And yeah, I think that looks fine for our example. Okay, so now think about it. We have two layers of validation. We have the client side or the browser validation, but then we also have a second server side validation that can't be bypassed. and then extra small, and then a little margin on the top. Okay, one more time. And yeah, okay, one more time. And yeah, I think that looks fine for our example. Okay, so now think about it. We have two layers of validation. We have the client side or the browser validation, but then we also have a second server side validation that can't be bypassed. So even if we go through the terminal like we did earlier, notice body is required. Yeah, there it is. It doesn't work here either. And just to prove it, if we go back to Table Plus and refresh, yeah, there's no empty record here, which is really good. Okay, but we're still not done. Yes, we are ensuring that you give us something, but what if you give us too much of something like this? I often get this with the Laracast forum, where people think it's appropriate to paste 10,000 lines of code that they want your help with. And yeah, you may or may not want to allow for that. So yeah, I'm just copying and pasting this like a crazy person to show you that right now, you could give us a mass of text that we then insert into the database. And again, maybe you don't want to allow that. All right, so let's give it a shot. And yeah, as expected, we blindly throw all of that junk into our database table, which isn't ideal. So it sounds like we need a way to apply a maximum number of characters that we will allow, or a minimum. Like imagine you're creating a registration system and you want to say, well, the password that the user provides should be at least, I don't know, 7 characters and at most 255 characters, right? You want to set a minimum and a maximum for the number of characters that are provided. These are all things that validation can handle. All right, let's get to work. I will clear that out. Switch back to PHP Storm. And yeah, why don't we do another layer of validation? Let's do this. Let's copy that rule, and we will run another check. If the length is greater than some kind of arbitrary threshold you've set for your application, in this case, 1,000 might be too little. It just sort of depends on what these notes are. Can they be incredibly extensive, or are they really intended to be short notes? It just depends on what you're building. But yeah, for the example, we'll say, okay, the threshold, the maximum is 1,000 characters. And if you've gone over that, we can say the body cannot be more than 1,000 characters. All right, so we'll switch back, but actually, real quick. Notice before I do that, you can imagine situations where for any form input that the user fills out, there could be multiple validation violations that you need to report. Like, well, you did this wrong, but you also did that wrong. So if you want to allow for that, we might need to structure things a little bit differently. But for now, Let's just keep it simple. Okay, so anyways, we submit the form, and sure enough, a body is required. Now we require something, but I will add so many characters that will hopefully take us over the the 1,000 character maximum. We submit it, and the body cannot be more than 1,000 characters, which is great. But now we're on to the next problem. And I'm sorry, I told you, all of programming is solving problems. It's all you do. So yeah, the next problem is, even if you make a little mistake like this, maybe you didn't intend to do this, notice I submit the form, and I've now lost everything that I typed there. And maybe I would have preferred to fix the mistake rather than starting from scratch. Very likely that's the case. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, let's come back and let's go to our view. And maybe right here, as the value, of course, we can just add gibberish here, and that will be included. So maybe we could just say, well, if we have anything in the post message body for this, then we should echo it out. So maybe something like this: echo post body. But yeah, it's not enough to do this. This might be your first thought. But notice if we give this a refresh, yeah, we get a warning, undefined array key body. Because remember, if we're just performing a GET request, then the post superglobal will be empty, and that means there will not be a body key. So we can't always assume it. I'll show you a little trick here, though. I'll show you the long form and then the shortcut. In the past, we would use the isSet function. So look in in this array and let me know if a body key is set or exists. And if that's the case, I can represent that with a question mark. Then we will echo out that value. Otherwise, we will echo nothing. Yeah, I don't know if we've reviewed this yet. This is the ternary operator. Think of it as a alternative syntax for if-else statements. So the question mark is if. So if this condition is true, then do this. Else, represented by the colon, do this. All right, so yeah, you'll often reach for it for simple little one-liners that aren't too complex. But you can see right here that my editor is squawking because there's actually an easier way to do that. So this is the benefit of using an IDE, is they will often give you little tips like this. So notice I can replace this, and this is the equivalent. I think it was introduced as part of PHP 8 or 8.1. I'm not sure. Maybe 8, something like that. But yeah, this is the equivalent. So yeah, these two question marks here, technically, they are referred to as the null coalescing operator. If you want to get some points at dinner parties or lose some points more realistically. But yeah, it just checks if this value exists and is not null, which is basically what we were doing earlier. So yeah, if it exists, then echo it. Otherwise, echo an empty string. All right, come back, give it another run, and yeah, I think we're in business here. So now if I paste in something that breaks the validation like we did before, notice that this time we see the validation error, but we don't lose what we typed into this text area. And yeah, that's probably what you lose some points more realistic. But yeah, it just checks if this value exists and is not null, which is basically what we were doing earlier. So yeah, if it exists, then echo it. Otherwise, echo an empty string. All right, come back, give it another run, and yeah, I think we're in business here. So now if I paste in something that breaks the validation like we did before, notice that this time we see the validation error, but we don't lose what we typed into this text area. And yeah, that's probably what you want. Okay, so now I think I've taken up enough of your time for this episode. But yeah, if we switch back to our controller, this does the trick, but as you can imagine, it could get messy very quickly. And then further, if we repeatedly perform these checks for every single form on our site, that just doesn't seem to make sense to me. And that's a little too much duplication for my taste. So in the next episode, we're going to extract all of this into a dedicated validation class. I'll see you then. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's jump right in. So yeah, in the last episode, we toyed around with writing our first set of validation rules. But then we realized, well, it probably would make sense to extract this logic into its own file or its own class. And that way, I only have to write the logic one time, and then throughout the entire application, I can reference an existing function or method. Okay, so let's do that now. I'm going to call this class, well, validator. Okay, class validator. And yeah, at least initially, I'm going to keep this class very simple and also very pure. And I'll show you an example. We'll start with something simple, like validating that you've given us a string of a certain size. Okay, so we need the value. And yeah, if I switch back to the controller, we could pluck this logic that we wrote in the last episode and paste it in here and return the result. Okay, so now I can swap this out with the value you give us when you call the function. Okay. Let's give that a shot. I'm going to switch back and require the controller. And actually, real quick, if we have not discussed this, I can require a file like this. Or I can use it almost like a function. Both will work just the same. And you can see sometimes I will absentmindedly use both, coming from the JavaScript world, where there's also a require function. Look at the post fail, right? Body validation the database form by using I will return it. Okay, so one more time. But yeah, in real life and at the testing this out. So just temporarily, I'm going to disable that. But yeah. String and then pass through the post body. And yeah, so I've just taken the logic that we had in this. There's also a okay, so now I can swap this out with the value you give us when you call the function. Okay, let's give that a shot. I'm going to switch back and require the controller. And actually, real quick, if we have not discussed this, I can require a file like this, or I can use it almost like a function. Both will work just the same. And you can see sometimes I will absentmindedly use both, coming from the JavaScript world, where there's also a require function. But yeah, generally just stick with one or the other. Okay, so with that in mind, I will use this approach. Okay. Okay, cool. So now, yeah, well, at least initially, I would have to instantiate a new validator. And then right here, I could use validator, string, and then pass through the post body. And yeah, so I've just taken the logic that we had in this file and extracted it to a dedicated class. Okay, so let's give that a shot. I switch to the browser, refresh. I try to submit to the page, and sure enough, our validation is still working. Okay, but a couple ideas to think about. What if the user gives us an empty string? So I'm just holding down the space bar here. Well, if I submit it, it seems like that worked. So we go back to Table Plus, I give it a refresh, and now once again, we have a new row with a body that's not empty, but is composed of empty spaces. Okay, so let's delete that and make sure that we trim it before we perform the validation. All right, so back to PHP Storm. That we trim it before we perform the validation. All right, so back to PHP Storm, into our validator. And now I could say, well, why don't we trim the value before we check it? All right, so let's give it another shot. Once again, I will hold down the space bar. But yeah, this time, if I submit the form, the validation is working the way you'd expect. So we can see the validator shots where we check it. All right, so let's give it another shot. Once again, I will hold down the space bar. But yeah, this time, if I submit the form, the validation is working the way you'd expect. So we can see that the trim function that PHP provides literally trims off blank spaces before or after your string. And it turns out that's what we want in this case. Okay, great. But now, what about, well, actually, let's do this. Let's go back to the controller. And you can see we have another check where we make sure, for the example, that your note can't be more than 1,000 characters. Okay, so what would we do? Would we create a new function? Or would we simply expand our existing function to accept a minimum and maximum number of characters? And I think that second approach is probably the one we should use. Okay, so let's accept a minimum number of characters, and we'll set the minimum to 1. You have to give us at least 1 character by default. And then the maximum should be basically infinite. So unless you explicitly set or pass this argument, the maximum number of characters we allow is infinity, right? So in those cases, we can use INF for infinity. Okay, great. Okay, so now think about it. Let's start by saying, well, let's update the value variable by trimming it so that I don't have to do it more than one time. And then we will say, well, make sure that the value or the length, the number of characters of that value, is greater than or equal to the minimum, so in this case, greater than or equal to 1 by default, but also the length of the value is less than or equal to the maximum. Okay, and let's see if that works. So I will come back to my controller, and yeah, now I can merge these into one. So I will get rid of this and update this to validate string. I want the minimum to remain 1, but the maximum is 1,000 characters, which again, just to show you, if I bring this back, that's what we had at the end of the last episode. So yeah, now I'm just merging them into a single function call. And then I could update this string to be a little more generic. How about the body, or I'm sorry, a body of no more than 1,000 characters is required. Okay, and then finally, we should handle the case where it is not valid. So I'm going to negate it. If it is not valid, then update this errors array. Okay, let's have a look in the browser. So we submit it, and sure enough, the validation fails. Let's now add so much text that brings us over 1,000 characters. So I'm just pasting in lorem ipsum that paragraph over and over. That should be more than 1,000 characters, so we submit it, and once again, the validation fails. All right, and I think that's a pretty good refactor. Okay, so now let's talk about this. This method is what we would call a pure function, and I'll tell you what that means. A pure function is a function, and then we will say, well, make sure that the value or the length the number of characters of that value is greater than or equal to the minimum. So in this case, greater than or equal to 1 by default, but also the length of the value is less than or equal to the maximum. Okay, and let's see if that works. So I will come back to my controller, and yeah, now I can merge these into one. So I will get rid of this and update this to validate string. I want the minimum to remain 1. But the maximum is 1,000 characters, which again, just to show you, if I bring this back, that's what we had at the end of the last episode. So yeah, now I'm just merging them into a single function call. And then I could update this string to be a little more generic. How about the body, or I'm sorry, a body of no more than 1,000 characters is required. Okay, and then finally, we should handle the case where it is not valid. So I'm going to negate it. If it is not valid, then update this errors array. Okay, let's have a look in the browser. So we submit it, and sure enough, the validation fails. Let's now add so much text that brings us over 1,000 characters. So I'm just pasting in lorem ipsum that paragraph over and over. That should be more than 1,000 characters, so we submit it, and once again, the validation fails. All right, and I think that's a pretty good refactor. Okay, so now let's talk about this. This method is what we would call a pure function, and I'll tell you what that means. A pure function is a function that is not contingent or dependent upon state or values from the outside world. And by outside world, I literally mean the world that exists outside of this simple function. And again, what that translates to is within the body of this method, I'm not deferring to any internal state. I'm not referencing an outside class or object. It's all contained. So notice I call the method, I feed it some values, it works with the values, and then it returns a response. But there is no reference to this inside it, and that's what I mean by it's not dependent upon existing internal states. It's not deferring to a different class or a different object. It's all very simple and very pure. So in these cases, when you have pure functions, we can make them static. And that then allows us to call the method directly without first creating an instance of that class, like this. Let's switch back. And with this approach, I can now simply remove the instantiation and instead just say class name, : and then the name of the method. So yeah, these two colons are how we call or trigger a static method on a class. Okay, so if I come back and we give this another shot, it still works just the way it did before. But yeah, just to be crystal clear, if we don't explicitly make this a static function, we'll notice we're going to see some kind of fatal error because we are trying to interact or call this method as if it were static, but we didn't declare it as static. So make sure you add that static keyword. Okay, so yeah, in situations like this, for very simple and very, again, pure functions, this is a good way to go. Okay, great. So now, as you can imagine, your validator class could validate so many things, like make sure you gave me a proper URL, or make sure that you gave me a valid email address. Why don't we cover that example? Even though I don't have an existing user yet, we haven't built a registration system, just to give you an idea. Okay, so if we want that, we'd create a method called email. I would make it static, and yeah, we'd interact with it like this: validator, email, and then you'd give us the value that probably came from the registration form or something. So in this case, joe@example.com seems to be a valid email address. And actually on that note, notice it's not going to ping some existing service to make sure that it is a registered email address. It's just ensuring that it takes the form of an email address. So this would return true. But yes, something like this, well, that doesn't take the shape of an email address. So it would return false. Okay, so the implementation, well, there's a number of ways to do this. You could paste a very dramatic regular expression, but instead we're going to use a PHP function called filter var. And this gives us a way to sanitize or validate a string in a number of ways. And yeah, if you want, you can always just review the PHP documentation. But in this case, you can see we give it a value and then our desired filter. And again, switch to the documentation to see some examples. So yeah, things like, let's see if I can see, filter, validate, email. Yeah, here we go. Here's an example. So we call filter var, we give it the email address, and then we're going to reference our desired filter. And in this case, the one we want is filter validate email. So I will copy that, switch back, paste it in, and then I will accept the desired value and return the result. Okay, so now, yeah, again, we don't have an existing email address. This is just a quick example, but we could toy around with it right at the top by saying, and we'd say validator email, and let's start with something that is not a valid email address like this. So we come back, give it a refresh, and sure enough, it returns false. But if we instead provide a valid email address, you'll see it's not going to return true, but it will return the address itself, which is a truthy value. So in other words, I could say, well, if not validator email, then once again, that is not a valid email. Okay, but if we use a real one, I'm just being super crystal clear here to make sure we're all on the same page, then we don't trigger this DD function. So yeah, I'm just giving you some ideas here. And trust me, once it's time to build something like a registration form, this is going to be super handy. Think about it. To register, you probably have to provide a username, an email address, maybe a password. Okay, well, this will take you the whole way there, basically. Think about it. Well, let's validate your username using this method. Next, let's validate the email address using this method. And then finally, maybe you've decided passwords on your site need to be at least 7 characters long. All right, we would validate that using this method, but we'd set the minimum to 7, and that would take care of it. It takes you the whole way there. Okay, so now to wrap up, I want to note how the behavior that we currently have is no different than what we had had at the conclusion of the last episode. The only thing we've done here is tinkered and refactored and rewrote the code to be just a little more flexible and also, more importantly, pleasing to the eye. And trust me, that makes a huge difference. And I've noted this over and over. Programming is rewriting.